Hi everyone. So I'm going to be presenting on behalf of Pulsar platform, and we're going to be discussing an overview of online discussions around a major US retailer through the lens of our reputation model and how we like to look at brand reputation online. So my name's Tom. I'm a solutions consultant here at Pulsar. And what is Pulsar? Well, we're an audience intelligence company, and the way we work is we combine conversational and behavioral data signals from the world's leading data sources, particularly social and digital. Now, by behavioral data, what we mean is we're looking at what can be gleaned from how people interact with others online and what they're interested in online to create a picture of who they are, what they're interested in, and most importantly, what communities and networks do they exist in online. Conversational signals being slightly more simple, that's just looking at people's posts. So what are they actually saying? So are they saying they love coffee? Are they saying they hate football? However that plays out. And what we do on top of that data is we apply research and analytical frameworks to help structure social data in such a way that it helps you get more quickly to insights that are relevant and important to you as a business. So we're going to dive in here. So the way this analysis was structured was we were capturing all mentions of the brand of the retailer in question over a period of time. And we did 2 different periods of time where we were running audience segmentation. So all mentions of the brand from August the 1st to October 7th. And we then applied a framework of categorizing those mentions as they related to specific reputational dimensions or lenses that we could understand their reputation. And this was built out as a framework that was relevant to the brand in accordance to their specific objectives as they're kind of developing. So they have a very clear idea of how they want to position their brand going forward. And these are 5 different things that we saw as being particularly relevant to how they see themselves as a brand, but also how the public see them as a brand. So conversations about their environmental responsibilities, their DEI initiatives, their social initiatives, their citizenship, and their workplace. So environmental obviously being the way in which they're interacting with the earth and nature. So sustainability practices, climate change, emissions, stuff like that. DEI initiatives, so obviously their diversity, equality, and inclusivity ideas. Social is how are they representing themselves broadly in society and how are they helping society at a broad level, whereas citizenship is how are they helping more localized society. So how do they fit in into the wider ecosystem of businesses and of as an institution essentially around the locality. And then workplaces, what is the how are they treating their workers and what is it like to work there and how are they treating those in their stores and their employees essentially. We then did this over a separate period. So the way this worked essentially is we took all of those mentions and we categorized them via these dimensions. And then within the people discussing these different ideas, we ran them through segmentation processes. Now, the segmentation works by essentially identifying what are the organic communities that exist within that discussion. And those communities are based on follower-following relationships online. So where are they organically getting content from and who are they organically interacting with in the online space? And you can see there's quite a diverse set of different groups here. Some of them are politically or culturally aligned. Some of them are a bit more kind of interest aligned, like crypto groups. And some of them are more climate and sustainability groups, or just business specific groups. But as we moved forward from October 7th to November 10th, the conversations around the retailer actually took on quite a bit more of a heavy political, cultural skew. You can see that the DEI conversation moved from being one that was quite broadly interesting to different groups of people to being quite monolithic in terms of the different groups who were actually engaging with it. They were all, what would be considered traditionally as being right-wing. Whereas places like the workplace conversation had become somewhat more left-wing or progressive in its discussion. And we can just get a very quick view of how the different groups and networks interact with these kind of key ideas around your brand. This is a very kind of bird's eye view of how did that change and where does that conversation move towards. So once we've identified all of those different segments, we have a good indication of what makes them up. We then look to group together different segments which have overarching consistencies or similarities under broader umbrellas. So instead of looking at 5, 6 different conservative groups, we just look at one coherent conservative group, or groups of different what would be considered liberal groups. We actually just bucket them all together and look at that as, more broadly speaking, your liberal audience, a conservative audience, an African American audience, a business audience, a climate focused audience, or a finance audience. And so the community groups from period 1, talking about the major retailer, split out on this basis. But then as we move into period 2, we can see a big change in the makeup of all of those community groups. And again, as we noticed in the slides before, discussions around this brand, particularly around the key elements of their reputation, key elements of how they want to perceive them, to be perceived, have become quite heavily politicized, at least in terms of who is actually engaging with them. So liberal groups have jumped in size and taken up now nearly half of the whole conversation in terms of audience members, whereas conservative groups have also increased in size, and all of the other groups, bar African American culture, have completely fallen off. And the African American audience within this discussion has grown quite substantially. So then we can look and just start mapping out, well, what do the volumes of conversation look like by each community group? And how has that changed over time? So we can see that the conversation has essentially taken quite a low humming level across all community groups from August to October, but then spikes across every single group, wherein they've all been much more heavily engaged into that October to early November period. So we can make some call outs here. When we do some digging into the data, we can see that this red spike here, the conservative conversation spike, is a spike in conversation around the retailer's CRT employee training, and it's the reaction to the announcement of that training and that training going ahead. The liberal groups then have a slightly different spike in interest, which is around the minimum wage discussion and the Great Resignation conversation. But also, in keeping with that too, there's some early Black Friday, early promotions that people are engaging with as well. So there is still kind of an obvious commercial opportunity in there, alongside what is potentially perceived as quite a big reputational issue around a coherent trend of discussion in kind of the post-COVID or mid-COVID employment conversation. The business and retail discussion, that group, their discussion spikes because of a restocking of inventory around rare baseball cards. And then that African American kind of Black cultural audience has a huge engagement spike with regards to a female shopper's in-store experience and concerns for her safety after she was followed in and out of the store. So it's a tweet which we're going to actually bring up in just a little bit, that really spiked in engagement within that community and was picked up by quite a few people. So then we can break out this analysis and do a bit more digging into individual communities around their kind of sharing and engagement relationships. So we can look at stuff like engagements and posts per unique author by community. And this is from August 1st to November 10th. And you can see that while liberal and conservative groups have, broadly speaking, quite a similar amount of unique posts per unique author, sorry, the engagement per post is quite a huge discrepancy. Conservative groups are far more likely to engage with post than liberal groups, and it means that their posts and the posts coming from those communities tend to gain a lot more traction and are much more likely to go viral within that community of people and to pick up speed within that community of people. The finance community post individually quite a lot. This will be a lot of stock conversation, business news, kind of Bloomberg discussion, stuff like that, but very little engagement. So while they're creating a lot of content, there's not a huge amount of spread of that content, which kind of just sits on the online space and is there to be picked up. Business and retail, climate focus, quite similar, just slightly different degrees of engagement. And the African American cultural group, again, we can see that huge engagement figure here per unique author. And again, that's been quite heavily influenced by that post around the female shoppers in-store safety experience. So as we move on, we can say, how have the community groups changed? Well, first of all, just as a note, we've removed the finance community from the discussion just due to the lack of relevant segments in the second period. The largest change in the community group sizes was the African American group, wherein we had a 406% increase in size, which is interesting because actually it went from 3 segments to 1 segment, but that 1 segment was considerably larger. And the reason, as we said, is this tweet on the right-hand side here. And it's calling out a very specific location to say, to complain about the in-store experience of safety. And it's the 5th highest performing post across the entire period. And it was incredibly high performing within a specific group of people. As we can see, liberal groups have increased in about 5% of size, conservative groups by about 16%. Business and retail and climate focused have almost completely diminished into nothing in this period. So interestingly, across their key pillars, the groups of people whom are most likely to be engaging are politically or culturally aligned groups, rather than groups who have an interest or a vested interest in the business or in the business's wider strategic aims as it relates to the climate or sustainability practices. So we can then look specifically at this in the African American audience's discussion and see how that conversation has changed with regards to that specific post. So you can just look at the overall engagement and then engagements from that specific Black culturalists segment, which makes up the majority, the lion's share of that African American audience. You can see that on those days, they are making up just under 90% of the overall engagements that day. And then also the visibility of those posts is being primarily made up by, again, that same segment. So as you see here, a single tweet from B. Simone regarding her personal safety at a Maryland location ignited a huge engagement from the only identified African-American segment in period 2. The interesting part of this is that the original poster of the tweet, so this lady here, she was in fact not part of that segment. Her tweet was brought into that segment via a proxy and was then picked up by quite a cohesive network online and spread through that network incredibly quickly, and then became quite a serious post. And despite having a huge audience size and large engagement stats, most of the engagements were with specifically this post. So 7,800 of the 11,000 posts were engagements directly with that post rather than anything else. So that is the reason for the high indexation of the African American audience during that period. Outside of that, they are a very small segment. And it's using this to contextualize the engagement and also the reasons for engaging within those groups of people. Then we can break out this discussion more broadly by key corporate pillars as they see them. So what are the key messaging? What are the key ways in which they understand themselves and want to project themselves? And how are those engaged with by different groups of people? So we break up the conversation by DEI conversations, regeneration of people, regeneration of planet, and the philanthropic responsibility. So the regeneration of people kind of fits within that social workplace and citizenship conversation, whereas the regeneration of planet looks more broadly at the sustainability, the climate change discussion. And then obviously that philanthropic responsibility is kind of inextricably linked with the regeneration of people, but more around how are they providing charity rather than looking after kind of the local community. So obviously what jumps out here is that the two things that really get the most engagements are regeneration of people and DEI. And for conservative groups, the only thing they've actually spoken about within those key corporate pillars across August 1st and November 10th was the DEI discussion. Liberal groups are a bit more split between DEI and regeneration planet and philanthropic responsibility. Though they engage some people slightly, they haven't really done a huge amount in generating conversation, and it's not what people are discussing with regards to the major retailer. They are taking a very specific line on DEI conversations and the regeneration of people conversations. So then we can look at breaking up the conversation by what we call dimensions of reputation, and this is 7 different dimensions which we work to develop around what are the key ways in which you can understand your reputation online, and how does that break out into different kind of ideas. And the reason why we're doing this is, instead of looking at the conversation via a positive, negative, or neutral lens, it's actually just looking more at what is it that the audience cares about, what is it that your brand audience cares about when talking about your brand online. And it helps you better identify what are those drivers of reputation, what are those drivers of engagement, and how does that fit, how does that work between different groups of people? What different groups of people care about what different things. So we can see immediately the conversations that matter the most are workplace. That's across every single different group, from liberal, conservative, business or retail, and that Black cultural group, the African American audience. That is the most important thing that all people talk about. So the first thing you as a brand can then do is start to dig into, well, why do people talk about our workplace, and how can we better understand that to create a communication strategy that addresses those considerations and addresses those ideas. Following that is citizenship, and that is most important. That is over-indexing quite strongly with the liberal groups, and then conservative groups are engaging pretty broadly across leadership, governance, performance, and citizenship, whereas liberal groups are looking at citizenship and financial performance. But then outside of that, governance, leadership, technology, products and services, they're not that relevant, and they're not hugely important to the discussion. It's really this kind of more broad conversation around their workplace that is really driving what people talk about online and how they perceive the brand. So once we've identified that, you can then jump into a more qualitative framework around understanding what do those workplace conversations look like, and what are the dimensions of that workplace conversation. So by diving into the data directly, particularly around what conversations are conservative or liberal or whatever specific segment groups are having around workplace, you can start to break out more specifically what constitutes the workplace conversation. And then we can see here, this is what the workplace conversation looks like across those different groups, and how do different groups interact with it. So firstly, you can see the CRT training conversation is explicitly interesting to the conservative groups, but hasn't really got much traction outside of that. The vaccine mandate conversation is interesting across all groups, but not hugely interesting across any. In-store safety is something that explicitly is interesting to the African American cultural group, but the liberal groups, the things that they care about most of all is essentially employee welfare. So conversations around employees being on food stamps, or the conversation around minimum wage and it needing to be raised, the two things that are driving that discussion. And the reason why we do this is because to help understand what communication strategy looks like and what marketing strategies look like, you need to understand what different communities of people think about you and how they're interacting with similar topics, but in a different way. So if we're just looking at the discussion of workplace as a broad concept, we're not quite getting to the root of the fact that workplace means very different things to very different people. And if we're going to be speaking to the conservative groups, or if we're speaking to the liberal groups, we need to create a different strategy and a different press release or a different piece of content to address the specific things that they're interested in. Alternatively, if we just want to understand how is our reputation changing across different groups, and if we just want to look at it from a more of a how do we move the needle in terms of perceptions or reputation, similarly, understanding that how different groups are interacting across this will give you a far better view of what your reputation looks like and how you can potentially affect it as you move forward as a business. And then finally, a quick note on the online conservative network within this discussion. Now, we've seen across the board here, the conservative group, for the most part, only really ever has an interest in one thing. They only ever really engage with one thing specifically. And this is really important. And we can help to explain that phenomenon by looking at the network of influencers and the network of engagement that exists within that community. So what we're looking at here on the right is a network engagement map. Individual nodes are individual accounts. And at the center of some of these nodes, as you can see here, these are original posters. And the original posters have a little slightly darker circle in the middle of them to denote the fact that they're original poster, whereas the kind of more hollow circles, the more hollow nodes, they are engagers. And the lines between the different groups are engagement relationships. So someone in here is posted, people have kind of coalesced around them, engaged with their content, but then also content's being created here is being engaged with by this purple group too. So despite the fact that there's kind of an online spatial difference between some of these groups, they are highly connected with one another and have the ability to spread content very quickly. So the network of conservative groups online is highly connected and dense and coalesces around central influences, as we can see. High number of edges represents willingness to share content and ideas throughout the network with little to no friction, which means fundamentally that reputational threats from this type of network can generate huge visibility and engagement quickly, however, are potentially confined by the boundaries of the closed network. So while their ideas are unlikely to go mainstream, they will be seen and will be considered to be important issues within the context of the group represented. So the question then becomes here, do you see this group of people, or the conservative group, or whomever it might represent, as being an important consumer segment for your brand? If you do, then reputational threats that develop from this network will have a potentially quite serious effect on their perceptions of you as a brand and should be then considered within the context of that cohesive network. So to go through an executive summary, the key reputational pillar is workplace, and across multiple major audience groups, each with a unique reason for discussing the pillar, with CRT training and employee welfare being the highest indexing across two different key segments. Due to the highly cohesive and dense online network, conservative groups can drive high topic visibility quickly, i.e. CRT training, and therefore represent a potentially serious reputational threat when engaged. So the most consistent groups in discussing the retailer are culturally or politically aligned groups. Affinity or interest-based groups like climate, finance, and business groups almost entirely disappear during period 2 and are replaced by just much larger segments coming from those kind of cultural and political groups. So that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to start taking some questions.